there. You've reached Christian-apologist.com. As I get set up a little bit here, I've been away for a couple of days, but I'm back. And today we're going to talk a little bit about capitalism, socialism, other isms. We're going to talk about things such as abortion, euthanasia, eugenics, and we're going to talk about which people in society are supporting these sorts of programs. And I gave it away probably when you saw the advertisement for this, but the answer is that the Democrats are increasingly supporting these sorts of things, and they're not good for society. Why should you listen to what a business professor says? Well, because if you happen to go into our universities these days, one of the main places that you can go where we still retain some capitalism and we still promote the ideas of entrepreneurship and innovation and creativity is in the business schools. No socialist who would be a proponent of ideas from people like Marxist and others would be worth his while or worth his salt in a college of business. Colleges of businesses would laugh at anybody who advocates this idea that people can are not going to be are going to be paid basis on whether they're just in the business instead of whether or not they work hard. The idea that capitalists, or we just call us people who support free markets, the idea that we support free markets is we support hard work and payment accordingly. If you work hard, you should get paid well. If you come into my classroom and you work very hard to earn an A in the class, you will earn an A in the class if you work very hard. If you don't work hard, it's likely to earn a D or an F. Now, in the communist sort of society, the idea is not that everyone's going to earn a C, it's that everyone's going to end up flunking. Because after a while, in such a demotivating sort of a place, that's what ends up happening. You bring everybody into poverty. Let's take a look at a few social models, a few models of socialism. We have this idea that in the Scandinavian countries, they have a pretty good deal. Some people think they do. Well, we have to notice a few differences between Scandinavian countries and our country. Number one, we want to notice first that the Danish prime minister in 2015 said that Denmark is not a socialist society. Places such as Denmark, Sweden, and Norway have 25% value-added taxes, and they also tax very high the middle class. So if you're a middle-class person making about $60,000 in these countries, you can expect to pay about 60% of income tax. It's very high income tax. I want to say hi to Taking Back Eden. Effie, it's always good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. So you have to ask yourself, do you support these ideas? Now, again, let's go back to the Swedish model. Sweden only has about 10 million residents. The United States, at most recent census, we have about 331 million people. We're very heterogeneous, meaning we've got people of all kinds of different populations, all different colors, all different creeds. We've got a lot of variety here in the United States. And that's not the same over in Sweden or Finland or Norway. Those countries are much less heterogeneous, much more homogenous, many more white people, relatively speaking. So one of the things that they're doing in those societies, they do have universal health care and they do have ideas like that, but many people are still insured privately because they want better health care. A lot of times when you have universal health care in some of these systems, there are long delays to get the medical service and attention that you need. And so we see that throughout Europe. We see that in other places such as Canada, long waits. The real model that would be equivalent to something that some of the socialists in the United States are pushing for is actually that which is in Venezuela, although they won't tell you that. But what's interesting is people like Bernie Sanders have never really flown over to Scandinavian countries to look at their systems. Rather, he flies down to places like Venezuela to admire what Hugo Chavez started. And the problem with Venezuela is the vast majority of people today are starving. They're in the streets. Many of them have had their property taken away and seized by people like Chavez and Maduro. One of the things that Chavez actually had was a reality show where he would prance up and down the streets and he would take people's property away from them. And he would celebrate himself for doing that. Chavez, it's been recorded, had died in the billions, died with a net worth of in the billions. Chavez made a lot of money off the backs of his people. One of the first steps to devastation in Venezuela that he did was he went into a place that was one of the wealthiest countries in South America. And he decided that he was going to take over the oil industry because that was its most productive, most profitable source of money. And so he replaced 18,000 employees and the leaders of the oil industry over in Venezuela with his own people who didn't know what they were doing. And so he ended up tanking that business, completely driving it into the ground and impoverishing all of its people. Now, some of the programs that we see here in the United States that have to do with a lot of this fall into this idea of this great reset. There are people today who are scheming behind the scenes who seem to think that it would be better if we maintain the chaos. We keep wearing the masks even after most everybody's been vaccinated. We keep wearing masks outside. There's some place in the Northeast where people have decided they're going to still wear the masks outside. They're going to enforce that by law in some places, even though Biden said not to. They're still enforcing mask wearing inside. Now, why is that? Why would Biden get up in front of everybody and really encourage wearing a mask when he's been vaccinated and his staffers have all been vaccinated? I've been vaccinated. There is a 95% chance I will not be getting the coronavirus. So I don't feel like I should have to wear the mask, but I do wear it because I'm going to wait until they lift the regulations inside of stores and places like that. And I'll wear it because some people don't know that I've been vaccinated, and I don't have a little sign on my shirt that says, yes, I've been vaccinated, although I'm considering getting one. But anyway, so going back to this whole idea of what's going on. So let's take a look at this. We'll go back to the time of FDR. FDR was in office, as you know, for many terms before they had the 2-term limit. He was in office in the 30s and 40s. And he was in office during a time of the Great Depression. And he used the chaos of the Great Depression to usher in this idea of the New Deal. And at the time, it did help many people to keep their jobs. It created jobs for people, and it created jobs that some really didn't even need, but he wanted to make sure that people had food on the table. And he was able to get that program in. He was also able to get in the program of Social Security, which is essentially borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. In other words, we're working right now, and all of the money that we earn, 6.2% of our earnings, are paid into the government, and then they're matched by our employer. So the employer puts in another 6.2%. And so when we pay Social Security, we pay into this large fund, 12.4% of our earnings. It goes into a fund. This is, again, what FDR started. FDR was a Democrat. It goes into this fund, and then money comes out of the fund, but it doesn't go into a fund directly headed with me. Like, my money doesn't go into the fund. It doesn't say Stephanie Thomason pulls out the money. Instead, it goes into a larger fund, and they use that money for other causes during this time, including paying other people survival benefits and things like that. So you're supposed to, in theory, you're supposed to get money once you retire until the day you die through this system, this Social Security system. Seems like a pretty good idea, especially for people who might be very poor and have no other means to pay for themselves once they do retire. However, the issue with this, again, is the system might go broke. That's the problem when it gets to the point where not as many people are putting into the system as are taking out of the system. And so the issue is, they say, well, should we raise the rate? If we raise to 6.2%, that impacts everybody, poor, middle class, or upper class. If we raise the retirement age, and which they keep doing a little bit, that will certainly impact the younger people. And then the other option is to say, well, why don't we just raise the cap? The cap each year goes up a little bit. Right now, it's around $127,000, meaning that any money you make over that, you don't pay into Social Security. And so that's the idea, to protect the system. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because it's a system that's put in place. It's kind of like a large Ponzi scheme. Okay, whether or not I support it, I'm fine with it. Okay, it's been in place. It's all I've known. But I just want to say that it's a system that FDR put into place. Now, you'll be interested to know that the Democrats, and you can check me on this. In fact, I encourage you to fact check me on this. The Democrats were the party of being pro-slavery. Okay, you can go back and you can take a look at the votes in 1865, and you can take the votes of the Democrats throughout that time period. They were very much for slavery. They were also very much the founders of the KKK. Okay, so the Democrats were the ones who founded the KKK. In fact, they were the ones who were fighting against women's rights to vote. Okay, it wasn't the Republicans. The Republicans wanted women to vote. The Republicans were the conservative, kind-hearted people of the past. Interestingly enough, even during Title VII of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Democrats 37% of Democrats voted against it, and 20% of Republicans voted against it. That's more Democrats voting against a Civil Rights Act, which gave race, religion, color, national origin, and gender. They're all considered classifications, and people are given protections in the workplace against discrimination based on those class characteristics. Okay, the Democrats were actually against that. And then, really interestingly enough, right around the 1960s, and Dinesh D'Souza, I have to give him a lot of credit for a book I just finished of his that is on this sort of issue, on socialism and the United States of Socialism, his book is entitled. But what he noticed a person called Herbert Marcuse. And this Marcuse character identified a lot of things going on that the Democrats could seize. In the 1960s, he started writing pieces about some strategies that the Democrats could use to appeal to the disenfranchised. He wanted to spread his socialist agenda. And what he noticed is a lot of people were very content in the United States. And he realized that for socialism to come in and for capitalism to go out, he had to use force. That's something that Marx realized. Socialism doesn't just come in and it doesn't just usher itself in times of prosperity. So he realized that they can no longer be the party of the anti-slavery types and the racists and all that kind of stuff. He realized instead, why don't we go and appeal to the people who are the discontented? Okay, let's find the people in society who are the least happy. And so one of his strategies to find those people is he realized there's a war going on right now, the Vietnam War. And I think a good strategy in the Vietnam War is to not fight for our country, to not go into the Vietnam War. And so what he did is he promoted this idea that we should be anti-war, and we should not only protest against our government for putting us into Vietnam, but we should also make sure our soldiers feel really low when they come back. My uncle was in the Vietnam War, and he suffered immensely because of the Vietnam War. Mentally, he was never the same. He ended up dying just a few years after returning. But one thing that happened to him when he returned were a bunch of protesters were spitting on the soldiers and yelling all kinds of terrible epithets. And it was just a really awful time then for a soldier. Here you're coming back after fighting for your country and showing your bravery and trying to defend our flag and our institutions and our Constitution and all that kind of good stuff and our freedom. And how do people repay him? They were a bunch of hippies, a bunch of clowns, a bunch of insects in society, I would say. And what they treated them like dirt. Okay. Never again. I'm not fond of Jane. Jane Fonda was with them, marching with them. She's a fool. So anyway, he realized that he could go after those people and relabel them as being, rather than being people who didn't want to go into the draft, rather than being people who were protesting, he wanted to give them honorable titles, like they were protesting in a very honorable way. Okay, he was among a few academics who were coming up with these ideas. Again, socialist undercurrents. So then what happened was the years were passing and they're realizing, well, let's go after all of the disenfranchised groups, anyone who's discontent. Let's be the party that's going to represent minorities. Let's be the party that's going to represent the gay people, the LGBT community, all of that kind of stuff. And so the Democrats have done that. There's nothing wrong with wanting to help minorities. I think that that's a noble cause. I think we should want to help all of the people in society who need our help. But we want to be strategic in how you help people. One of the strategies of the socialists is they realize that if they give a lot of money to people, then what's going to happen is the people will come to value them. Okay, it's a real simple idea. So the idea is, okay, if we give you money, there's a new $6 trillion package that's been proposed by Biden. We've already received portions of that package through COVID payments. But the idea is to make people more dependent on the government. And so one of the things that the government has done since the 1960s is a lot of welfare programs. And a lot of welfare recipients find that it's actually more profitable to keep receiving welfare than it is to work, because work might not pay very much. They might not make much of an income working. And so many of them stay home. They ended up getting into drugs. They end up getting into trouble. Society ends up in decline. Okay, that's one bad thing. Now, another one is this Andrew Yang's idea of the universal basic income. Bad idea. Again, this is the idea that every family in the United States, every adult is going to receive $1,000 a month. This is going to cost trillions of dollars. It's a reckless idea. It's absolutely absurd. And of course, he's got this whole bad thing against Wall Street and the rich man. Again, they're the top 1%, the demonized portion of our population, many of whom are so foolish they're actually supporting the socialists, who are going to end up taking their money away from them like they usually do. That's how they work it. But anyway, I digress. I go back to Andrew Yang's idea. So this universal basic income, everyone gets $1,000 from the government. Now, how do you pay for it? Well, according to Andrew Yang, we're going to just go ahead and tax the heck out of the rich, or some have proposed, and actually Andrew Yang has actually mainly said he wants to go into Wall Street and try to figure out ways to get money from the Wall Streeters. And so again, what we're doing here is we're twisting values. When you pay people whether or not they work and whether or not they need it, you just pay them out money outright, you end up demotivating people. Now, one thing about socialists that I've found that's pretty consistent about people who really get into the idea that the Marxists proposed, or sort of communistic ideas, is many of these people have never worked a day in their life. Case in point, Karl Marx. He was a big mooch. He mooched off of his friend. Okay, he mooched off of Engels. And so he was a big mooch. And then we even go into today, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has never worked a real job in his life. He's only been a politician. However, strangely enough, he's worth millions of dollars and has multiple homes. Same with Bill and Hillary Clinton. I've seen estimates that the Clinton Foundation's worth $200 million, and Bill alone is worth $75 million. How is that a politician who spends his whole life serving the community is worth millions and millions of dollars? Well, ethics committees have investigated his some of the speeches that he's given. An hour-long speech, he might earn $600,000, and suddenly he's currying favors to people to whom he was speaking. That's a bit of a problem. Okay, same thing with Joe Biden. He's now worth millions of dollars. Okay, the BLM founders, they're worth millions of dollars. You see what's going on here? The money is going to these people, and they're not putting in an entrepreneurial type of workday. Okay, so they're worth millions of dollars, and they're supposed to be serving the public. That is what's going on. We go to the Scandinavian model. They're always saying that they want to endorse the Scandinavian model, but we go over there, we realize in Scandinavian countries, like I said, 25% value-added tax and very high taxes on even the middle class, 60% if you're making 60,000 or more. But the difference is Scandinavian politicians are not worth nearly so much money as US politicians. And it's pretty interesting how a politician could never work a day in his life like Bernie Sanders and get kicked out of a commune for his lack of working. That also happened to Bernie Sanders. And it can constantly be talking about our crumbling infrastructure and other issues, and yet be worth millions of dollars himself. Something's rotten here in Denmark. Another thing that we're finding from a lot of these people is the people who are at the top of our media. Now, here are the power sources today. Okay, so here's the power sources, and here's what we need to do today. So we have the top of our media. Okay, we have media right now. All news stations, aside from Fox News, are pretty much bent to the left. Okay, ABC, NBC, the Washington Post. We've got a lot of different sources. Actually, we do have the New York Post, which tend to be more conservative. The Wall Street Journal tends to be more conservative. But on television, Fox News is pretty much standalone. CNBC, MSNBC, they are much more leftist than Fox News. So one thing some people have proposed is trying to figure out more conservative voices out there. Sure, we have people on YouTube who are doing a pretty good job. Go to Michael Knowles, Ben Shapiro, The Daily Wire. These guys are doing a wonderful job. Take a look at Dinesh D'Souza. He's a new one I've just discovered. He's great. Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin. We've got a lot of people who are good voices out there. We have conservative voices, women voices. Candace Owens is another one. So there are people out there who are discussing these very important issues that are going on in our day. The Republicans and the conservatives are a party of order. We prefer order over chaos. We prefer equal rights, but proportionality. You deserve what you get. You put in work and you get paid proportionally. We don't believe in equality of outcomes. We believe in equality of opportunities. These are all good ideas, as far as I can see. We believe in authority and loyalty and patriotism and some other very important values, such as care for the poor and the needy. We do believe in setting up care for the poor and the needy. There are needy people who truly cannot work. They might be disabled in some way. They might just have certain circumstances that prevent them from working. We believe in helping those people, certainly, absolutely. It's never not about that. We also believe in this idea of valuing religion and letting people worship whom they feel like they want to worship. If you want to worship your car or Elon Musk or the Dogecoin, sure. Or if you want to worship yourself, go ahead. We see lots of billionaires doing that today. In fact, Elon Musk seems to think he's so important that he's going to set up a population on Mars and the moon. He's just going to totally ignore all the reports on radiation in Mars and the situation where your blood could boil in Mars. I mean, I just saw this one this morning. I saw all the things that could happen to the human body almost instantaneously if you're released into the Martian atmosphere. It's not a good place to live. So having the kahunas to think that you can set up civilization there is really, really outrageous. There's just no way that can happen. Okay, just let's take care of our own planet, which reminds me of another one of the gods that people have, environmentalism. Okay, initially we called it global warming, but actually no, in the 1970s, first it was global cooling, then it was global warming, and Al Gore came out with this inconvenient truth, and everybody hailed Al Gore and thought, you know, this is really great, all this kind of stuff Al's doing. And I'm not denying a lot of parts of global warming or climate change, as they call it now, because they realize we can't say it's warming when we have places like glaciers right now in Iceland and Greenland that have started growing again. So now we can't say it's warming necessarily if the glaciers are starting to grow. But one of the things with this whole idea of climate change is, sure, there are some greenhouse gases. We have evidence that some greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere and are making things a little bit more toxic for us potentially. And the temperature is slightly going up. In fact, it's gone up about 1 degree apparently, and we expect in the next 100 years another 1 degree. That's not something that AOC wants you to know. AOC in her Green New Deal, which is signed by other Democrats, like people like Bernie Sanders. AOC's Green New Deal is this idea that we're going to get rid of air flight. We're going to primarily work off of solar and wind and all sorts of different things like that. We're going to get rid of this oil and gas industry. They like this idea of rebuilding all structures in the United States. You think that's expensive? Well, estimates are that yes, it is. It's $93 trillion over 10 years. That's about $600,000 per person, but let's just ignore that little detail. So we have a lot of problems that are out there. Now let's go back to global warming as being a god. You will notice that a lot of people seem to think that global warming is sort of a god. You'll see their accounts set up completely about the environment. These are single issue voters if I've ever seen them. They complain a lot of times about Christians being single issue voters and just focusing on the abortion issue. However, a lot of them just focus on the environmental issue. But the question is not whether or not we're noticing that the temperatures could increase slightly or that the atmosphere might have higher levels of CO2, which is a problem. One of the things that we can do to work together to solve these problems is just try to reduce our carbon footprint. But going beyond that, I just want to point out the issue here. The issue is not that, yes, we're seeing evidence of sea level rise as well. Like, for example, if you go down to the Kiribati Islands, the island atolls in the Southern Pacific, you're going to notice that many of them have been abandoned since the sea level has risen. And so what people are doing is they're increasingly leaving the islands for the main island in Kiribati. And so we have evidence of some issues going on with that, and we need to work together. But we don't need to work into a frenzy where you suddenly have somebody who declares herself AOC czar. You know, her experience as a bartender really lends credence to her value as being the czar of our environment. But, and I'm obviously trying to be as kind as possible here, but I get a little frustrated when I read people like AOC with these bad ideas, and then I look at her background, her experience. She went to Boston College, but she apparently thinks that modern monetary theory is something that's somewhat economical, even though she was an economics major. Where does she even get that idea? I don't know who taught her it, but it's the idea that you borrow from one credit card to pay for another, essentially. It's an awful idea. And that's how she would fund this $93 trillion price tag. But anyway, what I wanted to say is, so these are some of the ideas coming from the left, and you have to watch out for them. You have to watch out for how they reframe society. Now, someone would say, well, what was Jesus? Well, Jesus, a lot of people refer to the early Christians, and they say, wait a second, in the early Christian societies, they were all giving up their goods for the common good. Many of them were traveling together, and they would stay at each other's homes, and they would do things like that sound socialist on the surface. But they aren't. They aren't because people willingly gave up their goods. The difference with socialism is the socialists will take your goods. Okay, that's what they've done down in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez just marched around taking people's personal property and reducing many people to paupers. Some are eating their pets. They have no money. They're starved. The stores are empty. Okay? Socialism has failed the Venezuelans. And that's one of the reasons why Donald Trump received a lot of the Southern vote, a lot of votes from people who'd been in Venezuela or from Miami or Cuba or places like that. They understand what socialism does and how it's completely destructive to a society. No, Jesus wasn't into that. He isn't into the idea of giving up goods for the church, giving to the church, giving to greater causes, helping the needy, helping the poor. Absolutely. But the socialist doesn't want to do that because socialism will put you into poverty. It just makes more people impoverished. Capitalism has done more for the world than any other economic system ever in raising people out of poverty. Every single day, 135,000 people are raised out of poverty under free markets. Okay? Since 1800, when people primarily consisted on $1 a day, and prior to that, all those years prior to that, we have raised millions and millions and millions out of poverty, and it continues on due to free markets. Free markets are a great way to motivate people. Why? You encourage entrepreneurship and creativity and innovation, and you give people property rights and you don't take it away. And you don't heavily tax the rich to such an extent that, as FDR came up with, 70, 80, 90% taxation on the wealthy. Okay, that's ridiculous. That disincentivizes people from trying to go out and make it big. Okay, you want to incentivize people to do well, to be good citizens. You also want to incentivize people, not through force, but by telling those business leaders. One of the things you might want to do once you make it big, make sure you don't forget the little guy. You know, I watched this video that I show my class a lot with Cirque du Soleil and a few other really good global organizations. And a lot of the founders of these organizations never forget their roots. And they give back to their employees, and they make sure that they empower their employees, and they value them, and they treat them like they're human capital, not human waste. They treat them like a name, not a number. They encourage engagement. That's a lot of the real value that you have in organizations such as that particular organization. But I'm going back to the early Christians. So they were doing this stuff willingly, which is not what socialism is. Another thing that Jesus gave us was the parable of the talents. And what happened in the parable of the talents? So there was a master, and he had 3 servants. He gave the first one 5 talents of gold, the second one 2, the third one 1, each according to his ability. Okay, so to each according to his ability. Now what he did was he encouraged them to go out and invest it. And so the first one went out and invested his 5 talents and turned it into 10 talents. The second one went out, invested his 2 talents and turned it into 4. The third one buried his talents. So he had the same talents. When they came in front of the master, the first one showed that he had the 10 talents. And the master said, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Second one, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Third one, the master scorned. Okay. God gives us each talents. All of us have certain abilities. To whom much has been given, much is expected. We need to give back. We need to be a voice of order, of Christianity, and of what Jesus would do. If Jesus valued equality of outcomes, he wouldn't have created people who have unequal abilities. We're supposed to do in proportion to what our abilities are. Some have many more abilities than others. Not everybody can be Michael Jordan, and not everybody's going to be Bill Gates, who dreams up this big idea for a business. Not everybody's going to be Warren Buffett or someone else quite like that, or have the talents of certain communicators, great oral communicators. I'll give it to Barack Obama. He's an amazing talent as far as communication. Jordan Peterson, his mind is immense. He does a great job sharing his views, and he's gathered a big crowd. But the thing that God expects is those people are going to go out there and use their talents. He might not expect as much from you or me. Maybe he doesn't expect that much at all. But he does expect you to do something, and he does give everybody something. We each have something to use. What you figure out is, what is your spiritual talent? What are you good at? What do you enjoy so much that it doesn't feel like work? You want to think about that. So the idea with the parable of the talents, again, is people are disproportionately given talents, and you're supposed to invest accordingly. Okay, so that is just one of the parables that would show that Jesus would enjoy the idea of free markets. And I think that the way that the world's set up indicates that, and the way that we're motivated internally. As I mentioned before, we're motivated and incentivized by knowing that if we work hard, we'll perform well, and expectancy theory shows that. If you guys aren't familiar with that theory, it's a pretty good one. It says that you expect that your effort is going to lead to performance, and the performance is going to lead to outcomes that you value. If you value the outcomes, this whole process is going to work out pretty well. Now, in a society like a communist society, it doesn't work so well. Some might point out China and they say, well, China, wow, China's just doing so well lately. It's doing really wonderfully. Sure, yeah, that's because they opened their doors to free markets. Same with India. India in 1991 opened its doors to free markets. India had operated on some socialist ideas prior to that. China is still authoritarian, but it has free markets, but it still takes away a lot of the property of people. In fact, one of the things that the Chinese are doing right now is they're incentivizing people who are running different states, different areas, and they're incentivizing some of these people to be innovative. And so, but they're not saying how they can be innovative, and they don't value property rights at all. So people who've protested, and this has been pointed out by places like Amnesty International, people who've protested against some of the Chinese leaders in some of these local provinces and local areas who've protested because these leaders are coming in there and taking away their property. A lot of times they put down the protesters by burying them alive. It's horrific. In China, 1.8 million Uyghurs are currently in a concentration camp. Many are being raped. Many are being victimized. This is the product of communism, okay? This is the idea of putting down one class or one group of people. The communists typically go after the bourgeoisie, the working man, the entrepreneur. That's what they tended to go after. Karl Marx said there was a class struggle between the wealthy bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But it's not that anymore today. Today's form of socialism, which is this idea that I think that Dinesh D'Souza really hit on well, is identity socialism. It's intersectionality. It's the idea that it's white versus black, rich versus poor, heterosexual versus homosexual. You're setting up a whole bunch of different ways to categorize people. It's very dangerous, okay? It's pitting people against each other. You know who else did that? Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez liked to really promote the fact that he himself was a non-white. And he really went after white people in Venezuela, and he went after the wealthy, and he made a lot of promotions for people who were brown and black over the white people. So it's just one of those things. When you start separating people, it ends up dividing people. And once you divide people, you end up with destruction. And we don't want to see that, I would hope. So I want to say hi to the people I see in the chat right now. I see World Teacher, Jagadjuru. Sorry if I can't pronounce your name very well. Spartan Theology, Taking Back Eden. So it's good to see you guys. It's always nice to see people in the chat. And so let me see what else I wanted to cover today. Another thing I wanted to mention that has been coming out of these ideas, these very bad ideas that were really started probably in the 40s, 50s, 60s. It's mainly when we started seeing some of this, but it's really come to a pinnacle right now today. Another one is the dissolution of the family structure. Okay, traditionally, we had the Leave It to Beaver kind of family in the 1950s. People like that idea, where there's mom, dad, and a couple kids living in a little house, the American dream with a white picket fence and a dog, maybe a cat, fish. Got a pretty good deal. Middle class, 2 cars, you have a refrigerator, you've got all kinds of modern appliances. Things have gotten pretty good. Air conditioning came about, started being popularized. Now you're seeing air conditioning all over the United States. It's easy to live here. We live in a very comfortable place. It's a good deal. Let's not ruin it. So that's the family structure. Now, some people are saying, well, we should scorn on the family structure. When people don't get married after they have kids, and this is a choice that's made, and it does vary as a function of which culture you're from. Some cultures encourage marriage more than others. Asian cultures tend to encourage marriage pretty much. Some Black cultures do not. And it's a real shame because we're seeing 65% of children in Black families are raised with single parents. And the challenge with that is one person, that's one income. And when you have one income, then you need to work. So when the mother, or it usually is the mother, is working the whole time and the kids are at home, they might not have any sort of oversight and they might get into trouble. And so they don't have the father figure in many cases. They don't have this idea that they should go to work necessarily. It depends on how the family is being funded. But it's just a difficult situation that ends up being a vicious spiral into more poverty. We need to encourage people to get married. We need to encourage people to have families and have big families. And don't go out and abort the inconvenient children inside of you. Okay? Kids are kids at conception. There's no arbitrary time when suddenly a person is conferred personhood. Okay? It's at conception, your life begins. Ask anyone who knows anything about the biology of a human, and they're not going to tell you that life begins at any other time besides conception. So what does that mean? That means that you should not end the life. The baby has a right to life at conception. And ending the life is going contrary to what our founding fathers had in our Constitution, where we're all given a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's something I wanted to point out. So that's the abortion idea. So I just wanted to say 60 million people have been aborted since 1973, when it was legalized in Roe v. Wade. I personally would like to see Roe v. Wade be turned over. I think one of the reasons why Christine Blasey Ford, who mysteriously has not been mentioned at all lately by the media, because the media are largely on the Democratic side, and they're largely pro-abortion, pro-murder. They're largely that. One of the reasons why we don't hear of her or the other two women who came forward and claimed that Kavanaugh also had sexually assaulted them is because they were lying. They were lying. Christy Blasey Ford could not tell us when specifically this case happened and where it happened, okay, when Kavanaugh supposedly assaulted her. She couldn't tell us when and where. That's ludicrous, okay? I had somebody waiting in the back of my car when I was a senior in college, where it was in Boca Raton at a particular place called the Lakeside. I remember exactly what happened. I remember the night it happened quite well. He was waiting in the back of my car. I got into the car. I had one leg out the door, one leg in my chair. A hand came up and squeezed my face and told me to shut up. Okay. And I escaped screaming into the parking lot, and I got away. I saw the guy because he got out of the car and he said, "Somebody help her." And I recognized the voice. And so I yelled that was the guy. People in the parking lot chased him. He got into a silver Porsche and took off. A couple years later, I tell the story to a friend, and she tells me, "You know who that was?" She said, "Well, that was probably David Miller. He was the black sheep of this really wealthy Boca Raton family, and he drove a silver Porsche." And she knew the family pretty well because they'd gone to the same school. And so I looked at the picture of him, and I remembered the person I saw, and I would make that connection. I can't be certain, but I'm pretty sure he ended up murdering and raping a bunch of women, and he's in prison right now. So, and I when I called again to tell the police, now I knew who the person was. I think it could be this person who did this to me. The policeman asked me for what I looked like and what I was wearing. Apparently I fit the profile. Real nice, huh? But I remember that. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because you remember where and when. You don't. It's not as non-specific as Christy Blasey Ford had alleged. And why did she do that? Why would somebody lie like that? Why would the other two women come forth and lie like that? Well, because they're so crazy inside and so pro-abortion. They're so pro this idea that it's a woman's right to end the life of her unborn child. Some even are okay with this idea that it's up to the third trimester. I mean, this is sick. These are sick people who need to get help. Some even are okay with the idea that even after the baby's born, if the mother and father don't want to accept responsibility and care for the baby, rather than give it up for adoption, knowing that there are plenty of people out there in private adoption agencies who are willing to take your child and take care of your child in a really good way. In fact, there's 36 couples for every single baby adopted, put up for adoption in a private adoption agency. But rather than do that, they're actually okay with infanticide. You've got somebody like Peter Singer endorsing that notion, which is egregious, truly morally egregious. So again, I'm going to sum up a few of the points that I made today. So one of the major points I'm making is that socialism hasn't gone away. Karl Marx really popularized this idea. Wasn't terribly popular during his lifetime, but certainly came into play under Lenin and Stalin, Mao Zedong, under Pol Pot in Cambodia. It's led to the slaughter of millions of people. They took away property from people in Russia. They took away property from people in China. No property rights. Same thing happening in Venezuela. Property rights are gone. And so anywhere that socialism or communism has been in the world, in any place at all, it's failed, okay? The people who are in Scandinavian countries consider their countries free markets. They have a lot of social programs, but they still consider themselves free markets, and they have very good property rights. The leaders in those Scandinavian countries are not wealthy, like some of the leaders in our society who have been lifelong politicians, wondering how our lifelong politicians like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden and the Clintons and the Obamas, wondering how they can afford these $1 million homes. In fact, the Obamas just bought apparently a $12 million oceanfront home up in somewhere in the Northeast. And so we've got that kind of thing going on. You're wondering, how do they make so much money? Well, they get speaking engagements. Sometimes it's to get good assignments. In other words, lobbyists, speaking engagements. You can see how that all goes together. But anyway, so socialism has been around since all of these times. It's never really gone away. Anytime that it's come to fruition in a country, such as Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, where else? USSR, China. We've got it in different places like that, Cambodia. Anytime it's come, it's failed. Now, we have really good comparisons to show what a market looks like under socialism versus what a market looks like under a free democracy and a free market society. We can look at East versus West Germany and the economic impact of each to the other. We can look at North versus South Korea. The societies that are free have done much better than the societies that are not. And that's one of the reasons that communism failed pretty well in 1989 with the fall of communism in many places. And so we still see, unfortunately today, we still see Venezuela, Cuba, and North Korea and Laos operating under these communistic influences, and they've done a really awful job for their people. So I want you to look out for that kind of stuff, because the sort of things that Karl Marx advocated were anti-God, anti-religion, anti-structure, anti-institution, anti-family, anti a lot of the things that we stand for and hold near and dear to our hearts here as Americans. And we also want to make sure that we pay attention to things that are creeping up in society and destroying our structures. Our institutions include things such as freedom of speech, freedom to worship whom we want, okay? We can worship whomever we want. And that is not something we want to see taken away. Some Democrats are into these ideas of heavy censorship. You need to look out for that. If we can have a sitting president lose his ability to tweet out something because Twitter is a private company, it's publicly traded, but it's private. It's a private company, private industry. That could be a bit of a problem. You want to make sure that we take a look at that. One thing that we need to really encourage is for some of the people with deeper pockets in our society who are on the conservative side, we need to encourage them to come out with more news, say more. Just get out there and have a voice, form a coalition. Okay. If you want to make change, you can go to what John Cotter has said in his change management principles. Your very first step is to create a sense of urgency. Okay. This is urgent. What they're doing right now is they're compelling people to certain kinds of speech. Okay. You're seeing that even over in England right now, in some of the universities, people are being compelled to use certain pronouns. That is something that's unheard of, compelled speech, okay? That's another thing. So you're looking at those kind of freedoms being taken away. Another thing that they did in Venezuela, and I've never been a real big advocate of guns. I've never even held a gun. But you know what? I like the fact that I have the right to hold a gun if I want to. I have that right. That's in the Second Amendment. Some of the things that they did in Venezuela is they rewrote the Constitution and they took away people's rights to bear arms. And they actually had a massive buyback. And so that's some of the things that the Democrats are proposing today. Now let's look at the sinister, ugly underbelly of this. So they get a massive buyback. Many citizens sell their guns back to the government. Then they take the rest of them by force. Now the government has the guns and the citizens do not have the guns. Okay. Now the government can propose things and the citizens have no way to protect themselves. So like I said, when Hugo Chavez is in the streets on his reality show, taking away people's properties, people have no way to defend themselves. That's the reason why people have the right to bear arms here in the United States. You need to watch out for that. So we have a sense of urgency. You guys need to really take this seriously. Note the changes here in the past 10 years have been dramatic and mainly due to social media. Number 2, form a coalition. Find like-minded people who think similarly. Promote people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson. Encourage people like Donald Trump to get his own media station. Why not? Why shouldn't Trump have some sort of Trump news? I'm surprised he actually doesn't have that yet. Because we need to have other alternatives aside from Fox News. There should be other places where people can go and hear conservative voices. Number 3, you want to take a look at a vision. What is the vision for society? I would like to see us kind of similar to how the Reagan society was in the 1980s in certain ways. Reagan came in and he was a very strong voice. He appealed to 94% of the population, 94% of the vote. It's amazing. In 1984, he had 94% of the vote, and up against Mondale, who had a paltry part of the vote. So we also want to take a look at how they're trying to, now they want DC to be made into its own state. Why are they doing that? Because they want to curb and tip the tables in their favor. They're talking about packing the courts. FDR talked about packing the courts. Why are they doing that? Because they don't like the idea that right now there are 6 conservatives and only 3 liberals in the court. So they want to stack the deck against the conservatives. Again, that's what they're doing. We need to take a look at that. We need to have a vision that puts us in place. We value family structures, we value order, we value law, we value the rule of law, property rights, the rights that we have been given in our Constitution. We value all of that kind of stuff as good American citizens. And we don't value the chaos and the people who are trying to defund the police and do all of these insane ideas. This stuff is crazy. It's right out of George Orwell's 1984. It's insane. Other things that we value life. Let's figure out ways that we can get Roe v. Wade repealed, I should say. I actually found a case where a man was suing, I think it happened in Alabama kind of recently, but a man was suing a woman he impregnated because she had an abortion and he really wanted her to bear the child. Now, some people think, oh my gosh, that's so bad. Why would he sue? It's a child. He believes firmly that a life is formed at conception. And so he sued her for taking that life away. And he sued actually in the name of the baby as a representative of the child, the unborn child whom she'd killed. And he sued the clinic, the abortion clinic. Let's see something like that get up to the Supreme Court right now when we got that nice 6-3 lopsidedness. Another thing that we want to think about is, again, to protect our free speech, to establish other channels, to look at places like Parler. I've been on Parler. It's not very exciting because there just really aren't that many people on there, and maybe I just don't really know how to find them, but Parler isn't terribly interesting. But we need something like that does gain some momentum. We need alternatives to YouTube. Here I'm using YouTube and I'm preaching against it in some ways. I like YouTube. It's a very handy way to go and transmit messages. It's a place that lots of people go. Millions of people peruse YouTube videos. But we need alternatives to go to as well, because if they do decide to shut us down, we saw, again, like I mentioned, Twitter Jack Dorsey was just having a field day the day that he decided to cancel Donald Trump. We want to make sure that we protest when we see people's voices get canceled. They want people to get fired from their jobs for voicing their opinions. Okay, that is a problem. You should be able to voice your opinion in a free society. This is not China. This is not a place where we have to worry about being able to voice our opinions. And we should not have to worry about losing our jobs because somebody doesn't like the way that we disagree with them about issues like abortion or euthanasia or not believing that we're made in God's image. God said we're made in his image. He doesn't make mistakes. That's the way it works. Genesis 1:27, we're all made in his image, and he also considers our bodies sacred vessels. And we're supposed to take care of ourselves, and we're supposed to take care of our neighbors. And we're supposed to love one another and love each other and love him above all else. Those are the rules. It's laid it out pretty simply. And so those of you who have left, who are listening here, and you're here because you're maybe an atheist or agnostic, I know I've got a few of you in the chat because I can see the chat, and if you've left the faith, the Christian faith, because you encountered nasty Christians or something awful in the church or just a bunch of people who were acting like arrogant prigs, I agree with you that there are some people out there who are like that. People have accused me of being like that. I hope I don't come off that way because I certainly know that in real life I've never been given those kind of accusations, but maybe here when I'm interacting with people online, maybe people have different feelings. But if you've encountered people, and that's the reason why you're saying you've left the faith, is realize you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. God is God, whether or not there's some nasty Christian person who lives next door to you, or it was in your church, or is pretending to be something he or she isn't. There's hypocrites. There are hypocrites in the church. Sure, definitely. I've seen him leaving the church parking lot, skidding out and cutting in front of people right after they're coming out of a service. I've seen that. But that's not good enough reason to say that therefore God doesn't exist. It doesn't follow that way. Okay, so that's just something to think about. Another thing just to worry about or to keep your eyes on is to look at this idea of big government. When government decides it wants more control, what it does is it figures out ways to increase its size and increase its paws, its tentacles. And so with the $6 trillion plan that Biden has come up with, it's increasing our deficit. Right now, I think if I've last checked, we were at about $28 trillion in deficit. We're operating in a really bad way. We're like on a collision course. We have to figure out ways to cut back on spending, not to increase spending. Now, Biden's way to cut back on spending is to increase taxes. And I'm personally not terribly invested in whether or not he increases taxes. It's not going to impact me that much that I care that much about taxation. But I feel like there should be other ways to encourage productivity. And one of them is to think about ways to enhance production, innovation, creation, and entrepreneurship. Encourage people to go out and form businesses. Think of new ideas and new ways to get into the markets. And think of free markets and appreciate the fact that capitalism has really dragged us from $1 a day in the 1800s to living very comfortably. We've got a huge middle class here in the United States. Average income here is very high. Last I checked, I believe it was around $50,000 or $60,000 a year that the average American is making. The average working American, I should say, is making. And so that's a lot of money. We've got a high GDP per capita here in the United States. China, not so much. China's about $12,000 a year. So it's not a good deal to live in a place like China. And so I'm just mentioning that because I think we've got a lot of freedoms that people take for granted. And you get lazy and you sit around and you think, oh, well, this United States, sitting there as your keyboard warrior, it's just an awful place here. Is this awful? Look at this. That's my neighborhood. It's beautiful. The United States is beautiful. I can go around into just about any neighborhood and take some fantastic pictures of just natural beauty that we see out there that God has blessed us with. We should be appreciative of living in this great country. You won the lotto in life here. Other people would give you've seen the desperation that many people have in trying to get over to our country, which actually brings up the last thing I'm going to talk about today, and that's the people at the border, okay? Now, I don't agree with the label that some people want to give them of illegals. I don't think that's the best approach. I'd rather call them undocumented people, people who are desiring to get into the United States. There are paths to citizenship that are legal. The main thing with the Republicans that they feel is they want people to come over here using legal ways. A lot of people have come into our country. We're a beautiful, beautiful melting pot. People come here and they assimilate and they become Americans. They don't feel like they're outsiders once they assimilate here and learn our language. They feel like they're insiders. They don't feel like they're excluded. We're an inclusive country. We appreciate and love the idea of diversity. We love seeing people of all colors, races, religions. We love that. And we encourage people to use all the legal means to get here. The reason why people want to see you use legal means to get here is because those are our structures that we've created so that we can make sure that everything's fairly applied to people who desire to come into this country. Now, if people come over here without securing the legal means, just out of desperation, or they send their kids over here, things like that, unfortunately, that can encourage have some negative side effects, such as somehow drug dealers might be able to get in, or terrorists, or people like that. So it's not that there haven't been any terrorists that they've apprehended. They have. They've found terrorists who've crossed the southern borders and got in that way. So you want to make sure people come over legally, because otherwise it's like they're cutting in line in front of the people who are, otherwise if people come over here illegally, or we encourage that or promote that, you're just opening the door and they're just essentially cutting the line right in front of people who are coming over here through other means. Now, I also think that, like what Reagan did a long time ago, and I know this is controversial, and I know some people in my audience who are on the conservative side will not like this opinion, but I do think at this point, You know, in the 80s, Reagan gave the undocumented workers a legal means, a means to legalization. Many of them didn't even take him up on the offer, but he offered that olive branch and said, hey, let's figure out a way that you can be here legally so you don't have to worry and be looking around, looking over the corner of your back all the time and worried about being apprehended and tossed back into your country. There's 12 million people, they've estimated, who are undocumented workers here. If we figured out a way to offer them a path to citizenship, then if that came from the Republican side, imagine what a boon that could be to the Republican Party. People don't think that way. That's what the Democrats are thinking. They're thinking if they keep the doors open and they allow people to come in here illegally, one day if there is a path to citizenship for those people, and once they have the legal way to vote, they will be voting for the Democrats. Let's be pretty, we need to be thinking really closely about this. As Republicans, we have always been a nation of immigrants. We've formed that way. That's why we're so diverse. We've got people from all over the globe. We're not homogenous like the Scandinavian societies and other societies. So we might think about doing that kind of thing. So encouraging legal immigration is something we want to do. Perhaps considering offering a path to citizenship for people who are here undocumented. And the last thing that I want to say is we do need to have borders. We do need protections. We actually need that, okay? We need to make sure that our walls are secure around the country, just so that we can enforce our rules. You can't just easily go into any country and get into these, I mean, I shouldn't say any country. You can't get into many countries and just suddenly assimilate there. There are paths to citizenship in all countries if you want to become a citizen. It might be much more difficult in some places, but we might consider making it less difficult and offering that olive branch. You never know who the next person could be who comes over here. Did you know, did you know that Steve Jobs was adopted? His mother had the choice to abort him and she decided to give birth to him. He was given up for adoption. Many of our other heads of companies, heads of state, very important people in this country came over from other places. Dinesh D'Souza, whom I mentioned, he came from India. Other people have come from, I'm trying to remember where, I can't remember the places. There was somebody else I wanted to mention, but I'm forgetting that now. I want to say hi to Marshall Sharp, Taking Back Eden. Who else did I see here? I said Hellbound Heathen in the chat. Nathaniel Robinson. Got a nice group of people here. So thank you so much, you guys, for coming in today. My name is Mud is here. Got a good group. JB is here. I don't even know if I've seen JB in my thing. The canceled one, huh? Who else do we have? One Cow Stampede. I saw Susan earlier. Diagoras of Melos. So we got a lot of good people in the chat. Yeah, my name is Mud. Okay, so you guys, thank you for coming in today. I hope you'll like and subscribe and do come in again. I'm not supporting, I'm trying to figure out what choice. Diagolos must be talking to somebody else because I'm very much pro-life. I will say that. I'm pro the idea of having more people. In the crazy irony about abortions is that, number one, 60 million people have been aborted who could be good, productive members of society today, and many of those people are minorities. It's more dangerous to be an unborn child in New York City than it is to be a born child in New York City. It's much more dangerous, especially if you're a Black unborn child. Very high chance of being aborted, and we need to do things that we really encourage and help people and encourage them to have their kids. As I mentioned before, 36 families are in adoption agencies for every single baby put up for adoption. So thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, and do come again.